Tonight you're stepping into a world that smells nothing like your own. There is no running water here, no porcelain sink, no bar of soap warming in a dish, no clean towel waiting on a hook by the door. The air in this place carries the weight of unwashed wool and old wood smoke, of tallow candles burning low and greasy, of stone walls that have never once been scrubbed, of floor rushes that were last changed when the leaves were still green on the trees outside. There is a distant wind somewhere beyond these walls, threading itself through the wooden shutters, carrying with it the cold and the dark and the particular silence of a very old night. You are settling in now. You are letting your breathing slow, letting your body grow heavy and still against whatever is holding you. The room around you is becoming less present, and something older is becoming more so, the way it does at this hour, when the day has finally finished its business and the night has taken over completely. Somewhere not far from where you sit in the imagined geography of this quiet journey, a king is preparing for bed. He is powerful, he is feared. He commands armies and signs treaties and holds the fate of entire kingdoms in his unwashed hands. His name is spoken with something between reverence and terror in the courts and markets and villages of his realm. Painters have painted him. Poets have composed verses in his praise. When he enters a room, people move. When he speaks, rooms go quiet. The whole enormous machinery of medieval governance, the lords and the bishops and the sheriffs and the knights, runs at least nominally on his authority, in his name, under his seal. And yet tonight, in the soft, uncertain light of this quiet hour, we are going to learn something about him that no royal portrait would ever dare reveal. Because the most powerful people in the medieval world were also, quite frequently, some of the least hygienic people who have ever lived. And that is what we are here to explore. Tonight, we will travel across 9 centuries and 9 thrones. We will visit the courts of kings who bathed perhaps once a season, if that. We will sit in the great halls where hunting dogs slept beside men at the fire, and the rushes on the floor had not been changed since midsummer, and the whole magnificent edifice of medieval power smelled, beneath the incense and the spiced wine and the expensive perfume, of something much more animal and much more honest. We will follow the slow, candlelit lives of 9 monarchs whose relationship with cleanliness would, by the standards of your bathroom this evening, make your skin crawl. And yet, we will find in each of their stories something deeply, quietly fascinating, because these men were not simply negligent. They were not simply careless. They were living in a world with entirely different assumptions about the body, about cleanliness, about what a king owed to his public image, and what he could reasonably ignore in the privacy of his own apartments. They were human beings navigating the extraordinary difficulty of being simultaneously a symbol and a person, an institution and a body, a figure of divine authority and a man with gout. This is not a story told quickly. We will take our time with it, the way history deserves. We will linger in the details. We will let the sensory reality of another century settle around us like dust settling in a room that has not been opened in a long time. So settle in, let your breathing slow, let your shoulders drop. Tonight belongs to the past, and the past has nowhere it needs to be. If you find yourself drawn to slow, immersive storytelling like this, the kind that feels more like drifting through time than watching a screen, then the quiet past is exactly the channel for you. Every video we make is long and unhurried and designed for the late hours, for the quiet mind, for the evening when you want to go somewhere without going anywhere. A gentle subscription means you will never miss the next one, and it costs you nothing but a single quiet click. We are grateful for every person who finds their way here. Now, let us continue into the dark. King John of England, 1166-1216, the man who bathed 4 times a year and called it thorough. Let us begin in England. We will begin there because England in the early 13th century is one of those places that rewards slow, careful attention. It is not a comfortable place, exactly. It is wet and cold for much of the year, politically volatile in ways that make its court a constant source of anxiety, and governed, in the years we are about to examine, by a king whom almost no one in his own time seemed to particularly like. But it is a place with extraordinary texture. It has the specific density of a country that has been layered over and over with history, Roman, Saxon, Viking, Norman, until the weight of it is almost visible in the stones of its buildings, almost audible in the accents of its people. And it has a king whose domestic habits have left historians both fascinated and quietly appalled for 800 years. His name was John, not John the Great. Not John the Pious or John the Magnificent or John the Beloved or any of those other epithets that medieval kings sometimes collected like tokens at a market fair. Just John, plain John. King John of England, sometimes called John Lackland in his youth, a nickname his father gave him that was not intended as a compliment, and which John knew, and which seems to have settled into him in those early years like a splinter that was never quite fully removed, no matter how many years or how much power accumulated around it. He was born in December of 1166, the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, and if you know anything about that family, you will understand immediately that being born into it was not the straightforward gift it might appear. Henry II was one of the most formidable kings England had ever had. He reformed the legal system, extended royal authority, and built an empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. But he was also a man whose temper was volcanic and whose relationship with his family was comprehensively disastrous. His archbishop, Thomas Becket, was murdered in Canterbury Cathedral by knights who may or may not have been acting on Henry's implied wishes. His sons, the young King Henry, Richard, Geoffrey, and finally John, would rebel against him at various points, sometimes collectively, in wars that brought genuine grief to Henry's later years. Eleanor of Aquitaine was, if anything, more remarkable than her husband. She had been Queen of France before she was Queen of England. She was a patron of troubadour poetry and courtly culture. She managed Aquitaine with considerable competence during the long years when she was effectively imprisoned by Henry after backing their son's rebellion. She lived to be 82, which in the 12th century bordered on miraculous. Into this family, with its enormous energy and its enormous dysfunction, John was born last, after the elder brothers who had gotten the territories and the titles and the expectations. After Richard, who was already being identified as the warrior prince, the one who would be remembered. After the politics and the wars had already established the family's patterns, John was given at birth very little, no land initially, no great title. Just the fact of being born into one of the most powerful families in Europe, with all the pressure and the expectation that entailed, and none of the ready resources that his brothers had. He would eventually inherit everything. He would become king when Richard died on campaign in France in 1199, struck by a crossbow bolt at the siege of Châlons-Chabrol. He would inherit not just the throne of England, but the Norman territories in France, the claim to lands that stretched from the Atlantic coast of France to the hills of the Welsh border. And he would, over the following 17 years, lose an extraordinary amount of it. But we are not here tonight primarily to tell the political story of King John. That story has been told many times by many historians who are far more qualified to assess the military strategy and the constitutional significance than we need to be tonight. We are here for the private John, the John of the bedchamber and the dinner table and the slow morning hours before court began, the John who left behind, in the extraordinary administrative machinery of the medieval English crown, enough personal detail to give us a genuinely intimate picture of how he actually lived. And that picture, when you sit with it long enough, is fascinatingly human in its disorder. Let us begin with the household records. One of the remarkable facts about medieval English kingship, remarkable, that is, from the perspective of someone who lives in a world of digital record keeping, is how much paperwork it generated and how much of that paperwork has survived. The pipe rolls, the close rolls, the patent rolls, the household accounts. The wardrobe accounts, which tracked the personal expenses of the king's household with a degree of detail that is, for historians, an absolute goldmine. All of this material was produced in Latin on sheets of parchment, sewn together into rolls, and stored in various royal repositories where much of it remained, largely undisturbed, for centuries. From these records, we know, among many other things, that King John took a bath. We know this because bathing had a cost: heating water, providing the wooden tub, hiring the servants who managed the process, and costs were recorded. And what the records show for the year 1209 is that John bathed on average roughly once every 3 weeks, sometimes a little more frequently, sometimes less. Over the course of a year, this works out to perhaps 15 or 16 baths. Now, before you react to this with the modern instinct to simply say, "That's disgusting," let us put it in context, because the context is genuinely important and genuinely interesting. Medieval people bathed. This bears repeating, because the popular image of the medieval world as universally unwashed and indifferent to cleanliness is both wrong and unfair. Medieval people bathed, though not with the daily or twice-daily regularity of the modern world. They bathed for social reasons. Bathing before a feast or a significant ceremony was expected of people of status. They bathed for religious reasons. The church encouraged cleanliness as a reflection of spiritual virtue, and certain religious observances involved ritual washing. They bathed because, on some level, they did not like being dirty, just as most people in most times have not liked being dirty. The difference was that bathing required effort in a way that it does not in your world tonight. There was no hot water that came from a tap. Every drop of hot water needed for a bath had to be drawn from a well or a river, carried to the fire, heated over that fire, and then carried again to wherever the bathing vessel was set up. This was labor-intensive and time-consuming, and the labor was done by servants, which meant that bathing was partly a matter of social status. The more servants you had, the more easily you could bathe, and the more frequently it could reasonably be expected of you. Kings had servants, many of them. The royal household of a medieval English king was a substantial enterprise. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of people whose various roles included, among many other things, the management of the king's personal needs. Bathing was among those needs, and the resources to fulfill it were available. So John bathing roughly once every 3 weeks is not, in itself, extraordinary for his era or his status. What makes John's hygiene story interesting is not any single fact, but the accumulation of details that together paint a portrait of a man who was, in the texture of his private life, somewhat more disordered than the official image of a medieval king was supposed to be. Let us talk about the mornings. Medieval kings were expected to keep certain hours. The day began early, both by necessity and by convention. Morning mass was an expected part of royal observance. The business of governance, receiving petitions, meeting with counselors, issuing writs and orders, had its own rhythms that required a king to be visible and functional at reasonable hours. The whole machinery of court life ran on a schedule that assumed a king who rose at a reasonable hour and presented himself for the various obligations of the day. John was known, remarked upon, in fact, in the chronicles of his time, for rising late. Late in the medieval context means something like what it means today, staying in bed past the point when everyone else has risen and is waiting for you, staying in bed well into the morning hours when court had been expected to begin and petitioners had been waiting in anterooms for some time. This was not, in the medieval calculus, simply a matter of personal preference. A king who lay in bed until the sun was high was a king who was not doing his job. The chroniclers who noted this, and several of them did, treated it as a symptom of a larger character flaw, a lack of the discipline and commitment that kingship required. They were probably not wrong, at least in terms of the political consequences. A king who was hard to access, who ran on an internal schedule that did not match the external demands of the office, created a particular kind of frustration in the people who needed things from him. And medieval governance required constant decision-making, disputes that needed resolution, appointments that needed filling, letters that needed answering. All of it waited while the king lay in his disordered bed. The bed itself, in a medieval royal household, was a significant object. The royal bed was a practical and ceremonial item, surrounded, in higher status households, by curtained hangings that provided some degree of warmth and privacy in rooms that were cold and drafty for much of the year. The sheets were linen, changed with varying frequency depending on the resources and habits of the household. The mattress was typically stuffed with wool or feathers, and sat on a wooden frame with rope or leather supports beneath it. John's bed, based on what we can infer from the household accounts, was a reasonably comfortable one for the era. He did not sleep on straw. He had the resources for linen, and for the regular services of the staff who maintained his chamber. But comfort is not the same as cleanliness, and a comfortable bed in a royal chamber in the early 13th century was still a bed in a cold stone building, in a room that was heated by a fireplace of variable efficiency, in a court that moved every few weeks to a different location, and set up its domestic arrangements in whatever castle or manor happened to be the next stop on the royal itinerary. The royal court moved constantly. This is one of the features of medieval English kingship that is hardest to translate into modern terms, because we are so accustomed to the idea of a seat of government being in a fixed place. The palace, the White House, the residence with its address and its permanent staff and its known location. Medieval kings did not work this way. They traveled their realm, partly to be seen and to administer justice in person in different parts of the country, and partly because the practical limits of medieval agriculture meant that a large household could not be fed from a single location for very long before moving on became necessary. John's court moved frequently, an average of something like every 3 to 4 days, by some estimates, though there were periods of greater and lesser stability. This constant movement had practical implications for everything, including personal hygiene. Setting up a bath required time and resources that were easier to manage in an established location than in a manor house where you had arrived 2 days ago and would leave in 3 more. The rhythm of constant travel worked against the kind of routine maintenance that even the modest bathing schedule of the era required. It also meant that the physical environment of the court was perpetually somewhat improvised. The great halls of English castles and manors were working spaces that served multiple functions simultaneously: eating space, sleeping space, gathering space, all in the same room depending on the time of day. The floor rushes that were used to provide insulation and absorb spills were replaced periodically but not frequently, and the smell of a great hall in winter, with the fire burning all day, the dogs sleeping by the hearth, the servants eating and sleeping in the same space, the accumulated debris of weeks of daily life, was a smell that you would recognize in an instant as something very different from your home this evening. John moved through all of this and added his own particular qualities to it. He was a man who ate enthusiastically, and this is documented. The household accounts that tell us about the bathing also tell us about the food, the quantities consumed, the quality purchased, the spices and wines and particular foods that the king preferred. John ate well. He ate rich food in substantial quantities, and he ate it with the gusto of a man who enjoyed the sensory pleasures of the table and did not particularly constrain himself. This matters for our story because the consequences of eating like a medieval king were not limited to the table. A diet heavily weighted toward meat, beef, pork, game, poultry, all of it fresh or salted or preserved in various ways that were not always fully successful, and strongly flavored with the spices that medieval cooking relied upon to mask the taste of meat that was not always perfectly fresh, produced, in the body that consumed it, certain outcomes. The skin secreted the evidence of this diet, the breath announced it. The body, in general, carried the evidence of what had been put into it. John also drank. This was not unusual for a medieval king. Wine and ale were the standard beverages of the era, partly because water from many sources was genuinely dangerous, and partly because the social culture of the medieval court ran on alcohol in ways that would be familiar to anyone who has spent time in an institution where drinking is a constant background activity. But John's drinking was noted by contemporaries as heavy even by the standards of a heavy drinking court, and heavy drinking has its own relationship with personal maintenance. His teeth, which would have been subject to no professional dental care and would have been cleaned, if at all, with rough cloths and various natural abrasives, were almost certainly in poor condition by middle age. Medieval dental disease was virtually universal among people who ate significant amounts of sugar and fermentable carbohydrates, and while the sugar available to a medieval English king was less refined and less ubiquitous than what you eat today, it was still present in quantities that were biologically significant: the honey in the mead, the dried fruits in the puddings, the sweetened spiced wines that were a feature of aristocratic entertaining. All of it did its work on John's teeth in the way it did on everyone's teeth in that world, but perhaps the most revealing thing about John and personal hygiene is not in any of these specific physical facts. It is in the texture of the complaints his contemporaries made about him. Medieval chroniclers had a vocabulary of royal criticism. When they wanted to attack a king, they reached for certain charges: cowardice, treachery, injustice, impiety, sexual immorality. These were the serious charges, the ones that had political and theological weight, the ones that could delegitimize a king in the eyes of his subjects and of posterity. They were the charges that mattered in the medieval world when you wanted to say that a king was unfit to rule. But alongside these formal charges, John's critics sometimes reached for something more visceral, more intimate, more essentially personal. They described him as slovenly, as self-indulgent, as a man whose private habits reflected a kind of contempt for the forms and disciplines that kingship required. They used language that connected his physical disorder to his moral disorder, and in doing so they were invoking a very medieval idea, that the body of the king was the body of the kingdom in miniature, and that a king whose personal habits were disordered was a king whose kingdom would reflect that disorder. This was not merely rhetorical. It was a genuine belief, grounded in the medical and philosophical frameworks of the era, that the inner state of a man expressed itself outward through his physical life. A king who was disciplined and controlled, who rose at proper hours, who maintained appropriate dignity in his person and his household, who managed his appetite and his rest with the self-governance that was expected of a man of his position. Such a king was demonstrating, through his body, that he was fit to govern. And a king who could not manage these things was raising a reasonable question about whether he could manage anything else. John could not manage many things. He lost Normandy to the French in 1204, the great inherited Norman territories that the English crown had held since the conquest of 1066, the loss of which was a genuine strategic and symbolic catastrophe. He fought the first version of what became the First Barons' War, a civil conflict with the major English landowners who had, by 1215, simply had enough of him. He was forced, at Runnymede, to sign Magna Carta, the Great Charter, not because he believed in its principles, but because he had run out of alternatives. The charter was, at its heart, a list of complaints about John's governance, translated into legal language and forced upon him by men who wanted to constrain him before he did further damage. He spent the rest of his short life trying to wriggle out of the commitments he had made at Runnymede. He died in October 1216 at Newark Castle in Nottinghamshire of dysentery. He was 49 years old. In the days before he died, he was crossing a tidal estuary called the Wash in Lincolnshire, and the baggage train that followed his army, his possessions, his documents, possibly some of the royal jewels, was caught by the incoming tide and lost. Whether this was bad planning or bad luck or a combination of both is something historians have been arguing about ever since. The dysentery that killed him is worth a moment's thought. Dysentery, the bloody, debilitating, potentially fatal intestinal illness caused by various bacteria and parasites, was one of the most common killers in the medieval world. It moved through armies and courts and monasteries and cities with terrible efficiency, because the conditions of medieval life, even royal life, made contaminated water almost impossible to avoid. The connection between fecal contamination and disease was not understood. Water that looked clean could carry the bacteria that caused dysentery, and without any means of testing or treating it, the risk was simply part of the environment. A king died of a disease of contaminated water. A king who bathed 15 times a year and ate from golden plates, and commanded the second most powerful kingdom in Europe, died of a disease that began, in all likelihood, in a cup of water or a piece of food that had been inadequately cleaned, in a royal kitchen that met the sanitation standards of the 13th century, which were standards that would horrify anyone operating a kitchen today. His body was buried at Worcester Cathedral, where his tomb still stands. His effigy shows him in royal robes, with a crown on his head and a scepter in his hand, his expression composed and dignified. The stone face tells you nothing about the late mornings, or the rushed and irregular baths, or the disordered great hall, or the smell of a court that moved every 3 days, but the records tell you if you know where to look. And tonight, in the soft quiet of this hour, we have been looking. There is a particular quality to John's story that is worth sitting with before we move on. It is not the quality of simple failure. John's reign was disastrous in many ways, and this is not in question. But the failure was not the simple failure of a man who lacked all qualities. John was, in fact, intelligent. He was competent at certain aspects of administration. He was personally brave in ways that his critics sometimes grudgingly acknowledged. He read. He maintained a genuine interest in the legal machinery of his kingdom that was not entirely without effect. He simply could not be consistent. He could not maintain the level of disciplined self-presentation, both physical and political, that medieval kingship required. He would do something right and then undermine it with something wrong. He would make a reasonable decision and then undo it with a petty act of vengeance. He would appear to have stabilized a situation and then destabilize it himself. This inconsistency extended to his personal life, to the rhythms of his daily existence, to the way he inhabited the role that history had handed him. He was a man perpetually at odds with the requirements of his own position, and that, perhaps more than any specific fact about his bathing habits or his breakfast hours, is the most human thing about him. We are going to move on now, from England and the cold and the rain and the disordered court of King John to somewhere warmer, to France. To a king who was, in many ways, John's opposite in terms of his reception by history, beloved where John was despised, celebrated where John was condemned, but who shared with John in the most intimate physical details of his daily life a somewhat relaxed relationship with the forms of personal cleanliness. Henry IV of France, 1553-1610, the most beloved smelly king in European history, and as the night deepens around us, let us travel south. South across the Channel, where the English weather gives way to the French, where the cold gray quality of the English sky becomes something more Mediterranean as you move past Paris and toward the Pyrenees, where the air has warmth in it and garlic in it, and something of the particular smell of old stone baking in the sun. We are going to France in the late 16th century, and the France we are arriving in is a country in a state of deep and painful exhaustion. The wars of religion have been burning through France for decades. The conflict between French Catholics and French Protestants, the Huguenots as they were called, had produced some of the most horrifying episodes of mass violence in French history. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, in which thousands of Protestants were killed in Paris and across France in the space of a few days, left a wound in the country's memory that would not close for generations. Towns had been besieged, families split along religious lines, communities that had once coexisted turned violently against each other. The political structure of France had been fractured in ways that the formal machinery of the monarchy struggled to contain. Into this fractured, exhausted, profoundly divided country came a man who would eventually bring something resembling peace. His name was Henry of Navarre, and he became Henry IV of France, and he would be remembered with genuine warmth as Le Bon Roi Henry, good King Henry, the king who granted the Edict of Nantes in 1598, giving Protestants formal legal protections and tolerance that they had not had before. The king who allegedly said, when asked about his desire for his people, that he wanted every French peasant to have a chicken in his pot on Sunday. The king who navigated the treacherous religious landscape of his era with a combination of political genius, personal charm, and a willingness to be pragmatic about his own religious commitments that his critics found morally unacceptable and his admirers found absolutely necessary. He was also, by almost universal agreement among his contemporaries, one of the least fragrant monarchs who ever sat on the French throne. This is not a small claim, given the competition. Henry of Navarre was born in December 1553 at the Château de Pau, in the small kingdom of Navarre that sat between France and Spain at the foot of the Pyrenees. His mother was Jeanne d'Albret, a remarkable woman who ruled Navarre with considerable competence and who was a devout Calvinist, deeply committed to the Protestant cause in France. His father was Antoine de Bourbon, a man whose religious and political commitments were considerably less stable than his wife's, and whose historical legacy is largely defined by being Henry's father. Henry grew up in a frontier kingdom. Navarre was not Paris. It was not the elaborate, ceremony-soaked world of the Valois court, with its hierarchies of precedence and its obsessive concern with the performance of status. It was a smaller court, a more direct court, a court where the outdoor life of hunting and riding and the practical business of governing a not very large territory shaped the daily reality of the people who lived in it. And Henry absorbed something of that smaller, more direct world into his bones in a way that he never entirely left behind, even when he became King of France and found himself at the center of the most elaborate court in Europe. He was, by temperament, a warm man, direct. Earthy, someone who enjoyed the company of ordinary people in a way that was unusual for his rank, who could talk to a blacksmith or a farmer with genuine interest, and without the performance of condescension that characterized so much aristocratic interaction with the lower orders. He was physically vigorous and comfortable outdoors. He had a sense of humor that ran to the body. He liked good wine and garlic and strong cheese, and the kind of simple, substantial food of the Pyrenean foothills that he had eaten as a boy. He also did not bathe very much. This was noted by enough of his contemporaries to establish it as a real feature of his daily life rather than an invention of critics or gossips. His correspondence, and Henry IV was a prolific letter writer, his letters surviving in substantial numbers and constituting one of the great personal documents of the era, contains references to his own smell that are sometimes made with remarkable candor. He was capable of writing to someone that he would be with them soon and that they should prepare themselves, which was his way of acknowledging, apparently cheerfully, that his personal odor was something that required psychological preparation. This is a remarkable quality in a king. Most monarchs of the era were deeply invested in their public image, in the carefully managed performance of royalty that maintained their authority and their dignity. To acknowledge, even obliquely and even in private correspondence, that one smelled was to introduce into that performance a note of self-aware humility that was, for the era and the rank, quite unusual. Henry seems to have been genuinely unbothered by his own smell. Not merely resigned to it, not simply unaware of it, the letters suggest that he knew perfectly well how he smelled, and had simply decided that this was not one of the problems in his life that required solution. He had rather a lot of other problems: religious civil war, assassination attempts, the political management of a country that had been trying to tear itself apart for 30 years. Against these concerns, the question of whether he bathed this week or last week probably did seem somewhat less urgent. His diet was a significant contributor. Henry IV's attachment to garlic was a matter of public knowledge in his own time. He had been given a clove of garlic to smell at his birth, in a Béarnais tradition that was meant to ensure the child's health and vigor. He ate garlic throughout his life in quantities that were noted and remarked upon. Raw garlic, cooked garlic, garlic in sauces and stews, and simply on its own with bread. The particular quality that garlic gives to the breath and the skin of someone who eats it in large quantities is something that many of you will recognize from the day after a particularly enthusiastic Italian meal, and Henry apparently maintained this quality as a permanent feature rather than an occasional one. He also ate strong cheese and drank heavily of the robust wines of the southwest of France. His sweat, which was the sweat of a man who rode and hunted and exercised outdoors regularly, and who ate and drank as described, was apparently impressive in its own right. The combination of all of these factors produced a personal presence that was, at close range, quite assertive. His second wife, Marie de Medici, whom he married in 1600, reportedly found the experience of their wedding night rather overwhelming in the olfactory sense. The story that she nearly fainted has been repeated enough times to suggest that it was at least based in something real, even if the specific detail of the near fainting is probably embellished in the way that wedding night stories tend to be. What is clearly true is that the Medici bride, who came from a Florentine court with its own considerable attention to the performances of refinement, found her new husband's personal reality quite different from anything she had been prepared to encounter. Henry's attitude toward all of this is perhaps best captured in a story, possibly apocryphal but characteristic, about a conversation with one of his mistresses. The mistress in question, the story goes, wrote to Henry asking him to bathe before he visited her, as his smell was becoming difficult to manage. Henry's response, according to the story, was essentially to tell her to get used to it. He had been smelling this way for years and saw no particular reason to change. Whether the specific conversation happened exactly as described matters less than what it captures about Henry's general approach. He was a man of enormous political flexibility. He changed his religion from Protestantism to Catholicism to secure the French throne, making the famous remark that Paris is worth a mass that has followed him through the centuries. But on the question of his personal hygiene, he seems to have been entirely inflexible. This was who he was. This was how he lived. If you wanted to be near him, you adapted to this reality rather than the other way around. Now, here is the remarkable thing. People loved him anyway, not universally, clearly. He was stabbed to death in his carriage in 1610, which is about as definitive a statement of not being universally loved as it is possible to receive. The assassin was a Catholic fanatic named François Ravaillac, who stabbed Henry in the Rue de la Ferronnerie in Paris on the 14th of May. While the king's carriage was stopped in traffic on its way to visit his great minister Sully. But among ordinary French people, the farmers and the craftsmen and the market women and the small landowners who made up the great majority of France's population, Henry IV achieved a degree of affection that was genuinely unusual for a monarch. He was seen as accessible, as honest, as someone who lived in the same physical world that they did, who ate the same kind of food and occupied the same human reality, who did not float above the common experience of embodied life in the way that some kings, surrounded by their ceremony and their perfume and their carefully managed presentations, seemed to float. The garlic may actually have helped with this. A king who smelled of garlic was, to a French peasant who also smelled of garlic, a comprehensible person, a familiar person, not someone from a different category of existence, but someone from the same category, dressed differently and given different responsibilities, but fundamentally composed of the same human material. There is an important contextual note to make here about the medical beliefs of Henry's era, because they are relevant to understanding why his contemporaries were not simply scandalized by his infrequent bathing. The 16th and early 17th century in France, and in Europe generally, operated with a medical framework inherited from ancient Greece and filtered through centuries of medieval scholarship. This was the framework of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was understood as the balance of these four substances, and disease as their imbalance. Treatment was aimed at restoring balance through diet, through exercise, through various medications, and through the management of what we might call environmental factors. Within this framework, bathing occupied a genuinely complicated position. The medical literature of the era was not uniformly enthusiastic about baths, particularly hot baths. The concern was that hot water opened the pores of the skin, and that once the pores were open, various harmful substances, miasmas, which were understood as the particulate matter of disease floating in the air, could enter the body through them. This concern was not entirely baseless in a period when hot public bathhouses did sometimes serve as environments for the transmission of infectious disease, even if the mechanism was not correctly understood. Henry's physicians, operating within this framework, would not necessarily have advocated strongly for more frequent bathing. Some of them might actively have counseled caution about it. The medical culture of the era provided Henry with a perfectly respectable intellectual framework within which his bathing habits were not simply negligence, but potentially rational health management. This does not, of course, change the smell. But it contextualizes the smell in a way that makes Henry less simply careless, and more a product of a specific historical moment in the understanding of the human body and its relationship to cleanliness. Henry IV was killed on the 14th of May, 1610. He was 56 years old. He left behind a France that was more peaceful and more tolerant than it had been in decades, a dynasty that would produce his grandson Louis XIV, and a legend of warm, accessible human kingship that the French have been drawing on ever since. He also left behind a court that had spent years managing the olfactory reality of his presence, and which must, on some level, have felt a shift when he was gone. The garlic is gone now, has been gone for 400 years. But in the quiet of this particular night, sitting with the story of Le Bon Roi Henry, there is something almost warm about it, something almost like the smell of a kitchen where someone who knows what they are doing is cooking for people they love. Let us stay in France for a little longer. Because France in this era offers something remarkable, a court culture so elaborate, so obsessed with the performance of magnificence, that the contrast between what that culture projected outward and what it concealed inward becomes, with the passage of centuries, one of the great comedies and tragedies of European history. We are going to Versailles. Louis XIV of France, 1638-1715, the Sun King and his morning ritual of public ceremony, private filth. Meanwhile, in another quiet corner of history, a king is waking up. He does not wake up alone, and he does not wake up in anything resembling privacy. He wakes up in a ceremony. The ceremony has a name, Le Lever du Roi, the rising of the king, and it is one of the most precisely choreographed events in the daily life of the most powerful monarchy in Europe, and it happens every morning, in the same order, with the same participants in their assigned roles, as reliably as the sun rising over the gardens that the king himself designed. It begins before dawn. A first valet, sleeping in the royal bedchamber itself on a small bed near the king's own great bed, wakes first. He rouses the king gently. The king is alive, which is confirmed and noted. Then the ceremony begins in earnest. In carefully graduated waves, people are admitted to the royal bedchamber, each wave representing a higher level of privilege, a closer degree of proximity to the sacred person of the monarch. The grand entree, the first group, includes the king's closest personal servants and his physician, who examines the king briefly. Then in sequence come more courtiers, the first gentleman of the bedchamber, the captain of the guard. The king is offered a small breakfast, often broth, sometimes a biscuit. He is helped to wash his face and hands, not with water in his later years, but with spirits of wine, a cotton cloth dampened with it and applied to the skin. He is helped to dress. His shirt is brought by a specific member of the household according to precise protocols of rank. If a prince of the blood is present, he has the right to hand the king his shirt, and this is a privilege taken seriously. And through all of this, the room is filling with people. By the time the king is dressed, dozens of courtiers may be present. They have watched him put on his stockings. They have watched him receive his wig, that extraordinary edifice of hair that adds 6 inches to his height and transforms him from a man who slept in a large bed into the king. They have observed all of this in a state of highly formal attentiveness, because being present at the lever was a privilege, and losing that privilege was a catastrophe, and so every expression on every face in that room was carefully managed toward the appropriate degree of respectful admiration. The king at the center of this ceremony was Louis XIV of France. Louis XIV, Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King, born in September 1638, died in September 1715, reigning for 72 years, the longest verified reign of any monarch in European history. The man who built Versailles, the man who said, or is supposed to have said, "L'État, c'est moi, I am the state." The man who transformed French culture, patronized the arts on a scale that had no recent precedent, and created at Versailles an image of royal magnificence so overwhelming that monarchs from every corner of Europe spent the next century trying to imitate it. He was also a man who, in his later decades, washed his face with spirits of wine instead of water and bathed proper, submerged himself in a tub of water, perhaps a handful of times a year. Let us be precise about this because precision matters here. Louis XIV is sometimes described as never bathing, which is an exaggeration. The historical record suggests that he bathed occasionally, particularly when young, and that he changed his shirts multiple times a day, the shirt change being the primary mechanism of cleanliness available to people who bathed infrequently, since linen absorbed sweat and could be washed separately from the body. He used scented powders and perfumes. He paid attention to his appearance with great care, and the appearance he presented to the world was one of immaculate, almost otherworldly magnificence. But actual immersion in water, the bath, became increasingly rare as he aged. His physicians were divided on the wisdom of it. Some argued for the benefits of bathing. Others, consistent with the medical anxieties of the era, counseled that immersion opened the pores to harmful influences. Louis, who had many physicians and who listened to them selectively, seems to have landed, in his later years, on the position that less bathing was the more prudent course. The result was that the most magnificently groomed monarch in Europe, the man whose wig and whose clothes and whose bearing projected an image of absolute transcendence, was underneath all of that display not particularly clean. But the display was real, and it mattered, and this is where Louis XIV's story becomes genuinely interesting rather than simply unsettling. Versailles was built on a principle. The principle was this: everything that the king did should be a performance of his power, and every aspect of that performance should be as overwhelming as possible. The building itself, which grew from a hunting lodge into a palace of extraordinary scale over several decades of construction, was designed to amaze. The gardens, which stretched for miles in every direction, were designed to amaze. The Hall of Mirrors, that corridor of glass and gilt and reflected light, was designed to stop the breath of everyone who walked through it. All of it was calculated to produce in the observer an effect of grandeur so complete, so total, so inescapable that the individual king, the specific, particular, physical human being who happened to be wearing the crown, became almost irrelevant. What you saw at Versailles was not a man. You saw an idea. You saw power-made architecture. And into this architecture, Louis XIV poured a social system of extraordinary complexity. The court of Versailles was a machine for managing the French aristocracy, and it worked by making every aspect of daily life at court into a competition for proximity to the king, who held the candlestick, who handed the shirt, who had the right to be present at the lever or the coucher, the reverse ceremony of putting the king to bed. Every one of these functions was a position, and every position had a rank, and the whole elaborate system kept the French nobility busy competing for prestige instead of competing for power, which was exactly what Louis intended. The genius of Versailles as a political instrument is genuinely breathtaking when you sit with it. Louis had taken the most dangerous class in France, the aristocracy, which had spent the previous century fighting the crown and each other in the wars that had produced Henry IV's France, and had transformed them into a kind of permanent court of honor at his palace, where they competed for the right to hand him a towel and were kept too busy with the elaborate rituals of court life to organize against him. This was political brilliance. It was also, practically speaking, a sanitation disaster. Because Versailles, this monument to human magnificence, this triumph of art and engineering and political management, was designed to house something like 10,000 people. Courtiers, servants, guards, cooks, stable hands, secretaries, physicians, musicians, priests, ladies-in-waiting, ambassadors and their retinues, the families of courtiers who lived at court and had no intention of leaving because leaving meant losing your position. All of these people lived in a building that had, despite its scale, genuinely inadequate provision for sanitation. The fountains of Versailles are famous. They are among the most photographed architectural features in the world. The Bassin de Pollen, the Fontaine de Latonne, the Grand Canal, the hydraulic engineering that made them possible was a genuine technical achievement, requiring the construction of an enormous pumping system to bring water from the Seine and distribute it through the gardens. The water was magnificent and abundant and very, very impressive, and almost none of it was directed toward the sanitation of the people who lived in the building. Versailles was built with some toilets, the chaises percées, the pierced chairs that served as commodes and were placed in various rooms. Louis himself had one near his bed, but the number of these facilities was grossly inadequate for the population they served. There were stairwells in Versailles that visitors commented upon specifically for their smell. There were corners of corridors that contemporaries described with careful circumspection as having been used for purposes other than passage. There was a general understanding, at the court of Versailles, that the building smelled like what it was: a very large number of human beings living in confined conditions with insufficient sanitation. Saint Simon, the great memoirist of the Versailles court, whose multi-volume account of life there is one of the primary sources for everything we know about it, wrote about the smell with a kind of resigned familiarity that suggests it was simply a constant feature of daily existence that everyone had learned to manage. Visitors from other courts, particularly from courts that had more modest pretensions and correspondingly more modest smells, sometimes wrote home about it with less resignation and more astonishment. The gardens, those beautiful formal gardens with their geometric beds and their sculpted hedges and their extraordinary vistas, were also, for a significant portion of the time Versailles was occupied, functioning as the primary outdoor toilet facility for a very large number of people. The ornate fountains played, and the formal parterres bloomed, and somewhere behind a hedge, someone who had spent the morning competing for the right to hand the king his shirt was dealing with the afternoon's more pressing requirements. Louis XIV himself was not immune to the constraints of his own palace. He spent significant portions of his days in rooms that were heated by fireplaces but not otherwise ventilated, surrounded by the usual features of a large household's daily life, in a body that changed its shirt frequently but bathed rarely, in a palace that smelled of what it was. His personal scent was managed through the use of perfume. Louis was known to be heavily perfumed, and perfume was used throughout the court both for its own sake and as a management tool for the ambient smells that were otherwise uncontrollable. The perfumers of France in this era were not merely craftsmen providing luxury goods. They were, in a very practical sense, essential service workers. There is a moment in the records, and it is the kind of moment that stays with you, when one of Louis's physicians records that the king's chamber, on a particular occasion, smelled so powerfully of various things that the physician had difficulty conducting his examination. This is a royal physician who spent his days in close proximity to the most powerful man in Europe, whose job required physical proximity to the royal body, noting in his records that the smell was a problem. Louis XIV died in September 1715, just days before his 77th birthday. He had reigned for 72 years. He had survived smallpox, which killed several of his children. He had survived the deaths of his son and his grandson and his great-grandson, all dying before him, leaving his throne to a 5-year-old great-great-grandson who became Louis XV. He died of gangrene of the leg, a condition his physicians watched develop over several weeks, attempting various treatments, while the most powerful monarch in Europe lay in his enormous golden bed and experienced the indignity of a body that was, for all the ceremony that attended it, simply a body. The Hall of Mirrors still catches the light. The smell is gone, dissipated into 3 centuries of air. What remains is the architecture, and the art, and the extraordinary record of a world that chose magnificence over practicality at every turn and got, in exchange, both a monument to human aspiration and a daily reality that was more complicated and more pungent than the official image ever acknowledged. We are going to leave France now, because France has given us 2 very different versions of the same story: the warm, personal, garlic-scented story of a king who loved his people and did not mind if they knew he was a person, and the cold, magnificent, ceremony-soaked story of a king who loved his image and constructed a palace to maintain it. And between them, France has told us most of what it has to tell about the relationship between royal power and personal hygiene. We are going somewhere colder now, much colder. Ivan IV of Russia, the terrible 1530-1584, a man whose body was a battlefield before the body politic was, and as the night deepens further, let us travel east. East across the great flat plain of Europe, past the edge of the world that medieval Western writers imagined as the boundary of the known and the beginning of the mythological, into the enormous, cold, Orthodox Christian world of Russia. Russia in the 16th century is a country of distances that Western Europeans in this era could barely comprehend, distances that make the English Channel feel like a puddle, that make the Rhine feel like a ditch, that stretch from the Baltic to the Pacific in ways that no single human life could ever fully traverse. A country of dark forests and frozen rivers and enormous silences, and at its center, Moscow, the Third Rome, the seat of the Tsars who claimed the legacy of Byzantium. Ivan IV came to the throne of Russia when he was 3 years old, when his father Vasily III died in 1533. He was formally crowned Tsar in 1547, the first Russian ruler to officially take that title at the age of 16. He would rule for 37 years after that, and in those years he would do things that left Russia fundamentally changed and in some ways fundamentally damaged. He is called Ivan Grozny in Russian. The word is usually translated as the terrible, which captures one dimension of what the word means, but the full semantic range of Grozny is broader than that. It includes something of awe-inspiring, something of formidable, something of the fear that attaches to genuine power rather than simply to cruelty. Ivan was all of these things. He was terrible in the modern sense. He did terrible things, things that caused tremendous suffering and that were disproportionate even by the standards of an era when the standards were not high. But he was also genuinely formidable, genuinely impressive in the scale of what he built and destroyed and changed. We are not here tonight to give a full accounting of Ivan's reign. That accounting would take many hours and would require a psychological portrait of considerable complexity, a man whose childhood was marked by genuine trauma and instability, whose early reign showed considerable political talent, and whose later reign descended into a paranoia so consuming that it cost Russia some of its most capable administrators and soldiers, and eventually cost Ivan his own son and heir. We are here for the body, the physical Ivan. The man who lived in a specific physical reality that was shaped by the most intense forces of faith and violence and obsession, and whose relationship with personal hygiene was, in its way, one of the most distinctive of any monarch we have encountered tonight. Let us begin with the banya. The Russian steam bath, the banya, was not merely a hygiene facility in 16th century Russia. It was a cultural institution, a social space, a ritual space, a healing space. Every level of Russian society had access to the banya, and the banya was used regularly. Weekly was not unusual, and more frequently than that was common during certain seasons or for certain purposes. The practice involved extreme heat, steam produced by throwing water on heated stones, the vigorous application of birch branches, the venik, to the skin to stimulate circulation and clean the pores, and then typically a plunge into cold water or snow, which was sometimes quite literally rolling in the snow outside the bathhouse door. This was a far more physically intensive relationship with cleanliness than anything we have encountered so far in our tour of Western European monarchs. John of England bathed in a wooden tub. Henry IV of France bathed occasionally and reluctantly. Louis XIV wiped his face with spirits of wine. The Russian banya tradition involved full-body immersion in an experience of extreme heat and physical stimulus that was genuinely purifying in its intensity. Ivan used the banya. This is important to say clearly, because it distinguishes his story from some of the others we have told tonight. He was not a man who avoided personal washing out of indifference or inconvenience. He was a man who engaged with the practices of cleanliness available in his culture, sometimes with great intensity. But Ivan's relationship with the banya had a quality that goes beyond hygiene. It had a quality that tells us something about the way this particular man experienced his own body. Ivan was deeply, intensely, sometimes overwhelmingly religious. This is not unusual for a medieval or early modern monarch. Religion was the air that everyone breathed in this era, and for a Tsar of Russia, who claimed a special relationship with the Orthodox Church and who had a genuine theological education, religion was not merely background but foreground, not merely a framework for understanding the world but a constant, living, urgent presence in daily experience. Ivan's religious practice included elements of physical mortification, the deliberate infliction of pain or discomfort on the body as a form of spiritual discipline, an acknowledgement of the body's sinfulness and the soul's need for purification. He fasted with genuine severity on the prescribed days of the church calendar. He prostrated himself on cold stone floors during prayer for extended periods in ways that left marks on his body. He wore, at certain periods, a hair shirt or an iron belt against his skin, devices that caused persistent low-level discomfort as a constant reminder of the penitent's condition. The banya in this context was not simply bathing. The extreme heat, the birch branches, the physical intensity of the experience, these could be incorporated into a practice of bodily suffering that was understood as spiritually valuable, even spiritually necessary. Ivan's use of the banya sometimes had this quality, not the casual weekly bath of a man maintaining personal hygiene, but an intense physical event with overtones of purgation, of burning away the unclean thing, of the body being subjected to an experience that went beyond comfort. He was also, at other periods, notably not bathing. Ivan's mental state varied dramatically over the course of his life. The historical record, supplemented by what we can infer from the medical analysis of his remains that has been conducted in more recent centuries, suggests a man who experienced what we might today recognize as severe psychological instability, episodes of paranoid thinking, of rage so consuming that it produced acts of violence, of a kind of burning intensity that alternated with something like exhaustion or depression. During the periods of psychological crisis, and there were several of them, including the long dark period of the Oprichnina, when Ivan unleashed a terror campaign against his own nobility that left thousands dead and the governmental capacity of Russia severely damaged, his personal habits became erratic. His appearance during these periods was described by contemporaries as disheveled, his beard and hair unkempt, his clothes worn for extended periods without changing. The discipline of the regular banya fell away during the darkest times. There is something deeply human in this. The connection between mental health and personal hygiene is something that anyone who has experienced depression or severe anxiety will recognize. When the mind is in crisis, the body's maintenance becomes difficult to sustain. The ordinary activities of daily care, washing, grooming, changing clothes, require a degree of motivation and executive function that mental illness can strip away. Ivan, in his darkest periods, seems to have experienced something like this, though we are translating across a vast gulf of time and culture and diagnostic framework in saying so. His physical body, in his later years, was in genuine distress. The analysis of his remains has found evidence of severe arthritis in the spine's spinal fusion, in fact, suggesting a level of pain that would have been significant and constant. He may also have been suffering from mercury poisoning, mercury being a common ingredient in various medical preparations of the era that were applied or consumed in ways that resulted in toxic accumulation. Chronic mercury poisoning produces, among other effects, neurological symptoms, mood instability, cognitive changes, the kind of volatility in behavior that characterized Ivan's later reign. A man in constant physical pain, who may have been slowly poisoned by his own physicians, who was psychologically volatile in ways that had both internal and possibly toxic causes, who lived under the enormous pressure of governing a vast empire in an era of military challenge and political instability. That man's relationship with his own body was not going to be straightforward. It was not going to be the simple matter of bathing schedules and laundry habits that it might be for someone in more ordinary circumstances. Ivan the Terrible's body was, in a very real sense, the first battlefield of his reign. He died in March 1584, apparently collapsing suddenly while setting up chess pieces for a game. He was 53 years old. The cause of death is uncertain. The mercury poisoning hypothesis is one. A general failure of a body that had been under extreme stress for years is another, possibly some acute event triggered by the chronic conditions. He died as he had lived, suddenly in the middle of something, with the world still demanding things of him. His legacy was, to put it gently, complicated. The territories he had added to Russia, Kazan, Astrakhan, the beginning of the Siberian expansion, were real and lasting contributions to Russian power. The institutions he had built and destroyed and rebuilt were part of the process by which Russia transformed itself from a regional power into something larger. But the human cost, the thousands killed by the Oprichnina, the institutional damage, the time of troubles that followed his death as the dynasty he had damaged struggled to survive, these things were also real and lasting. The Banya at Moscow was cold in March of 1584. Whatever use it had been put to in the days before Ivan collapsed over his chess game, we do not know. He went, as all people go, without the chance to prepare a better version of himself for history's accounting. He was simply a man, broken and powerful and strange, in a body that had been subjected to extremes of heat and cold and physical stress and possible chemical poisoning, and the particular violence of a life lived at the very edge of what human beings are capable of sustaining. The ice of a Russian march does not judge. The snow outside the bathhouse door does not remember. Only the records do. Soft ray anchor, and as the night deepens further around us. Let us travel west again. We have been in Russia, in the cold and the orthodox gravity of it, and now we are going back to the warmer latitudes of Central Europe. We are going to the Holy Roman Empire. We are going to a man whose physical problems were, compared to Ivan's, rather more prosaic, but whose management of those problems was, in its own quiet way, one of the great examples of royal procrastination in the history of European medicine. Frederick III, Holy Roman Emperor, 1415–1493, the emperor who waited too long. Meanwhile, in another quiet corner of history, an emperor is sitting with his feet up, not figuratively, literally. Frederick III, Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of the Habsburg domains in Central Europe, the man who would lay the foundations for the Habsburg dynasty's extraordinary subsequent history, was sitting with his feet elevated because his feet had been causing him trouble for years. And elevation was one of the few things that provided any relief. Frederick III does not have the dramatic profile of some of the rulers we have visited tonight. He was not a tyrant in the mold of Ivan. He was not a magnifico in the mold of Louis XIV. He was not beloved in the way of Henry IV or controversial in the way of John. He was, in many ways, a quiet man, methodical, long-lived, patient in a way that his contemporaries sometimes found maddening, and that historians have alternately praised as wisdom and criticized as passivity. He was born in 1415. He became Holy Roman Emperor in 1452, crowned by Pope Nicholas V in Rome in the last imperial coronation to be performed in the city itself. He reigned until his death in 1493, giving him a reign of 41 years, not as long as Louis XIV, but substantial, and in the Holy Roman Empire, where the emperor was elected rather than simply inheriting the position, 41 years represented a significant accumulation of political experience and dynastic momentum. He had a motto that has fascinated historians, A-E-I-O-U, the 5 vowels, which he had inscribed on his buildings and his possessions, and which stood for a Latin phrase, the precise interpretation of which has been debated. The most common reading is Austriae est imperare orbi universo. It is Austria's destiny to rule the whole world, though Frederick himself may have had other interpretations in mind. Whatever the precise meaning, the motto suggests a man of considerable dynastic ambition, someone who thought about the long arc of his family's destiny rather than simply the immediate demands of the next campaign or the next negotiation. This long-term thinking served the Habsburgs well. Frederick's patient, careful, sometimes infuriatingly slow management of Habsburg interests set the stage for his son Maximilian I, who would expand Habsburg power through strategic marriages rather than warfare, and for his great-grandson Charles V, who would inherit an empire that spanned Europe and the Americas. All of this had its roots in Frederick's long, patient, somewhat undramatic reign, but we are here for Frederick's feat. The Holy Roman Emperor, by the time he was in his 60s, was suffering from what appears from the contemporary descriptions to have been advanced gout, possibly complicated by what we might today recognize as diabetic vascular disease or simple poor circulation resulting from a high-fat diet and limited exercise. Gout is worth understanding properly because it appears in several of our stories tonight, and because it was one of the defining ailments of wealthy medieval men. It is caused by the accumulation of monosodium urate crystals in the joints. The crystals form when the concentration of uric acid in the blood exceeds its solubility, and they precipitate out into the joint space, where they cause an inflammatory reaction of extraordinary intensity. The pain of a gout attack in the big toe joint, the most common site, has been described as feeling like the joint is being squeezed in a vice while simultaneously being burned with a hot iron, and this description, from gout sufferers across the centuries, seems to be broadly consistent. The disease is strongly associated with diet. Purine-rich foods, organ meats like liver and kidney, red meat, shellfish, oily fish, and alcohol, particularly beer and wine, break down into uric acid in the body, and consuming large quantities of these foods raises uric acid levels and increases the risk of gout. The diet of a wealthy medieval nobleman was almost precisely designed to maximize gout risk: heavy in meat, heavy in wine, light in the vegetables and whole grains that would moderate uric acid levels. Frederick III ate like a wealthy medieval nobleman. Of course he did. That was who he was. And by his mid-60s, the accumulated consequence of decades of this diet, in a body that was not particularly active, and that had whatever genetic susceptibility to gout he had inherited from his Habsburg forebears, was a pair of feet that were in serious trouble. His toes were affected first, as is typical. The gout began with episodic attacks, sudden, intense, agonizing inflammations that lasted for days or weeks and then subsided, leaving the joint tender but functional. This is the classic pattern of gout in its early stages. The attacks might come once a year or twice or every few months, and between attacks the person might feel entirely normal. Over time, however, in patients whose gout is not treated, and in the 15th century, effective treatment for gout simply did not exist, the attacks become more frequent, the periods of remission shorter, and the damage to the joint tissue accumulates. The joints develop tophi, those deposits of uric acid crystals that are visible under the skin as white or yellowish nodules. The affected joints may become deformed. In severe cases, the tophi can erode through the skin, creating open lesions that discharge a characteristic chalky paste. Frederick's feet reached a point, in his 70s, where several of his toes had developed gangrenous infection. This was the result of the combination of gout-damaged tissue, compromised circulation, and crucially, an infection that had established itself in damaged tissue that could not fight it effectively. Gangrene in the feet and lower legs was one of the most feared complications of vascular disease and severe infection in the medieval era, because without antibiotics, once the tissue began to die, the infection could progress rapidly upward. Frederick's physicians, facing this situation, concluded that amputation was necessary, and Frederick said no. Or more precisely, Frederick did not say no exactly. He said not yet. He said, let us try something else first. He asked for more opinions, consulted additional physicians, applied additional remedies, and waited to see if things might improve without the need for such drastic action. This was entirely characteristic of the man. Frederick III was constitutionally reluctant to commit to irreversible decisions before he had exhausted all alternatives. and while this temperament served him reasonably well in politics, he outlasted several more aggressive contemporaries by the simple expedient of not engaging in their aggressive and often self-destructive strategies. It was considerably less useful when applied to gangrenous toes. While Frederick waited, the condition progressed. The smell of Frederick's apartments during this period was something that his attendants and visitors navigated as best they could. Gangrene has a distinctive smell, the smell of dying tissue, that is immediately recognizable and impossible to ignore. His attendants dealt with it using the tools available to them: herbs and fresh flowers, burning incense, the strategic application of various aromatic substances that were understood to combat the miasmatic quality of illness. The rooms were aired when weather permitted. The candles burned rosemary and lavender. None of it fully masked what the gangrene was doing in Frederick's feet. Eventually, the emperor conceded to the amputation. The surgery was performed. We do not have detailed accounts of the procedure itself, which may be a mercy, given the state of surgical practice in the 1480s, and Frederick survived it. He was, as noted, constitutionally durable, and he recovered sufficiently to continue ruling for several more years. He died in August 1493 at the age of 77. His tomb in the Stephansdom in Vienna is one of the great monuments of late medieval German sculpture. It was something Frederick had been commissioning and designing for years before his death, with the characteristic Habsburg attention to the presentation of the dynasty, even in stone. The effigy lies with complete and regal dignity, the feet of the recumbent figure composed and peaceful. Frederick III did not tell his tomb about the feet, but the medical records tell us, and the accounts of his household tell us, and the smell of those apartments in the winter of his last years tells us, if we listen in the particular way that this kind of history requires. He waited too long. That was his defining characteristic in life, and it was his defining characteristic in illness. A patient man facing an impatient disease. Charles II of Spain, 1661–1700, the end of a dynasty, written in a single body, and as the night continues to unfold, let us return to Spain. But we are going to a different Spain now, a later Spain, a Spain that is in a very specific kind of historical crisis. The Spain of Philip II, which we will visit later tonight, was the Spain of the Armada and the Counter-Reformation and El Escorial, powerful, austere, and very much in control of its own destiny. The Spain of Charles II, which we are visiting now, is the Spain of the long, slow end of that power, still enormously significant on paper, still controlling vast territories across Europe and the Americas, but governing them from a court in Madrid that has become in some ways a monument to its own entropy. The cause of this entropy is not political failure, exactly, and it is not military incompetence, though both of those things could be laid at the door of Charles II's reign. The cause is genetic. The Spanish Habsburgs, the branch of the Habsburg family that had inherited Spain from Ferdinand and Isabella through their descendants, had been practicing inbreeding for generations. This was not unusual for European royal families, who had strategic reasons for preferring marriages within the existing network of royal and aristocratic houses. Marriage was alliance, and marriage within the extended family kept alliances consolidated and territories undivided. But the Spanish Habsburgs had taken this practice further than most. Cousin married cousin, uncle married niece. The family tree, rather than branching outward as healthy genealogies do, had been progressively folding back on itself, concentrating the same genetic material over and over again across the generations. The consequence of this was visible in the portraits. The Habsburg jaw, the mandibular prognathism that appears in portrait after portrait of Habsburg monarchs, the protruding lower jaw, the thickened lower lip, had been growing more pronounced with each generation as the genetic basis for it was doubled and redoubled. In Philip IV, the grandfather of Charles II, it was already notable. In Charles II, it was extreme. Charles II of Spain could not close his mouth properly. His lower jaw protruded so far beyond his upper jaw that his upper and lower teeth did not meet in a functional bite. He could not chew solid food efficiently. He had difficulty forming certain sounds clearly when he spoke, and his speech was impaired in ways that required those around him to listen carefully. He drooled, because the natural mechanism by which saliva is managed, the closed mouth, the regular swallowing, was compromised by his anatomy. He also had a tongue that was disproportionately large, which contributed to the speech difficulties and the drooling and the general management challenges of eating. From the very beginning of his life, eating was an ordeal. His wet nurses reportedly had difficulty nursing him because his jaw prevented a normal latch. As he grew, his food had to be prepared in ways that could be managed without effective chewing, soft, liquid, pureed. The royal kitchen of the Spanish Habsburgs spent decades developing expertise in preparing food in forms that their sovereign could actually consume. The consequence of this was that Charles was consistently malnourished. Not starving, the royal kitchen was resourceful, and his condition was managed as well as the resources and medical knowledge of the era allowed. But eating enough food in digestible form to fully support a growing body was something Charles never quite achieved. He was physically small and physically weak in ways that were visible from childhood, and that persisted throughout his life. He had other medical problems in parallel: epilepsy or symptoms consistent with it, cognitive difficulties that limited his education and his ability to engage with the administrative demands of kingship, poor balance and difficulty walking in his earlier years, a general fragility that made his physicians perpetually anxious about his survival. That he survived as long as he did, to the age of 38, dying in November 1700, was a testament to the robust care provided by those physicians and to whatever reserves of physical constitution he had despite everything. His hygiene in these circumstances was not the primary problem, but it was a problem, and it was connected in interesting ways to everything else. The drooling that was a constant feature of Charles's existence meant that his clothes were frequently damp around the chin and neck, and needed to be changed and cleaned more often than was typical even for the elaborate wardrobe management of a Spanish king. His attendants, the gentlemen of the chamber who served his daily physical needs, dealt with this as part of their regular duties, but it was a persistent and demanding aspect of the royal service. His teeth, the teeth that could not occlude properly, that were therefore not being cleaned by the natural process of biting and chewing, that accumulated food debris in ways that properly occluding teeth do not, were in poor condition. His breath, which came from a mouth that never fully closed and which housed these teeth and a tongue that was slightly too large for the space, was apparently notable. Contemporaries who spent time in close proximity to the Spanish king wrote about it with varying degrees of diplomatic indirection and varying degrees of disguised discomfort. The oral smell was also connected to something called halitosis of gastric origin, the smell of a digestive system that was not working properly, that was not fully processing what was put into it, that was generating byproducts of incomplete digestion that escaped upward through the esophagus and presented themselves to the world. Charles II's digestive system, like everything else about him, was under pressure from the structural limitations of his anatomy. He also had lice, and this is one of those details that, even in the context of the 17th century, was considered notable. Lice were universal in early modern Europe. There is no level of society that was reliably free of them, including the highest, but in Charles's case the infestation appears to have been persistent and difficult to manage, connected to his general difficulty in maintaining regular personal hygiene and to the somewhat disorganized quality of his household. His court was not well run. This was not primarily Charles's fault. He did not have the cognitive capacity or the physical energy to be the kind of engaged, detail-oriented manager that running a court required, and the people who ran it in his stead were not always up to the task. The result was a court in Madrid that lacked the organizing clarity of, say, Versailles, and that reflected in its daily management the uncertainty and instability of a reign that everyone understood from very early on was going to end without a natural heir, because Charles II had no children. His wives, he married twice, the first wife dying and the second never producing children, were unable to conceive with him, for reasons that his medical situation makes quite understandable. And everyone in Europe, including Charles himself, was very aware that the question of who would inherit Spain after his death was going to be one of the most consequential questions in European politics for decades. That question was, ultimately, answered by Charles's death in 1700 and the subsequent War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that lasted 13 years and reshaped the political map of Europe. Charles's final will, influenced by his French wife and the French sympathizing faction at court, left everything to Louis XIV's grandson, Philip of Anjou, who became Philip V of Spain and founded the Spanish Bourbon dynasty that continues to the present day. All of this, the war, the dynasty, the whole transformation of European power that flowed from it, had its ultimate cause in the same place, in the generations of Habsburg inbreeding that produced, at their end, a man who could not chew his food properly and whose body bore the full weight of a dynasty's accumulated genetic vulnerabilities. His autopsy was conducted after his death, and the results survive in the Spanish royal archives. The report is extraordinary in its detail and in its grimness. His heart was described as being about the size of a peppercorn. His right lung was diseased. His intestines were gangrenous. His brain was described as containing no more than a small amount of water. The physicians who conducted the examination were reportedly not surprised by these findings. The wonder, as they saw it, was that Charles had lived to 38 given what his body had been dealing with all along. Charles II of Spain is a figure who invites something like grief if you let yourself feel it. He was not a villain, he was not a tyrant, he was not responsible for his own circumstances in any meaningful sense. He was simply a man who had been placed, by the accident of his birth, at the center of an enormous and powerful institution, in a body that was not equipped for the life it was required to live. His personal hygiene was the least of his challenges and the most visible symptom of a situation that was, in its entirety, beyond the capacity of any human being to fully manage. We will leave him here, in the Spanish night, with the fountain playing somewhere in the garden and the candles burning low in the Madrid apartments, in the silence that precedes the end of dynasties. King James I of England, 1566-1625, the wisest fool in Christendom and the least washed, let us return to England. England in the early 17th century is a country in the middle of a transition. The Tudor dynasty has ended. Elizabeth I, the Great Elizabeth, the Gloriana, the woman who managed for 45 years to be simultaneously the actual ruler of England and the symbolic center of a cult of royal femininity that kept her court and her country emotionally invested in her person, has died without a child, and the crown has passed to her nearest Protestant relation. That relation was James Stuart, King of Scotland, son of Mary Queen of Scots, aged 36 when he became James I of England in 1603. James had been King of Scotland since he was 13 months old, which is about as young as it is possible to be a king without being, technically, a fetus. His mother Mary had been forced to abdicate after a disastrous series of political and personal mistakes that included marrying the man widely believed to have murdered her previous husband, which did not endear her to her nobles. The infant James was crowned in her place and grew up as a ward of the state, educated by regents and tutors, and the general instability of a Scottish court that was in a perpetual state of political crisis. He was educated extremely well, despite the instability. His tutors, particularly the humanist scholar George Buchanan, gave him a thorough grounding in Latin, Greek, theology, philosophy, and the humanities. James grew into a man of genuine intellectual attainment. He wrote poetry, he wrote political philosophy, he wrote a book on witchcraft, demonology, published 1597. He engaged in theological debate with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed the exercise of argument. He was, by any reasonable measure, a very intelligent person. He was also, by the testimony of a remarkable number of people who encountered him in person, not particularly pleasant to be close to. The first and most persistent element of this was his relationship with water, specifically his aversion to washing his hands. James I of England, for reasons that are not entirely clear but that were widely noted and commented upon in his own time, did not like to wash his hands. He had apparently a genuine dislike of the sensation of water on his skin in general, and hand washing in particular was something he avoided with a consistency that was remarkable. When his hands needed cleaning, after eating, for example, or before a formal meal, he would rub his fingers together rather than submitting them to water. This is worth pausing on for a moment, because hand washing at meals was a significant social ritual in this period. The washing of hands before eating was performed ceremonially at formal feasts. Water was brought in a basin, poured over the hands were dried with a towel, and this process was both genuinely practical and symbolically meaningful, a demonstration of the host's hospitality and the guest's status. To refuse this ritual, or to substitute a hand rubbing for it, was to make a choice that people noticed. His contemporaries noticed. And they noted it not just as an eccentricity, but as a symptom of a broader quality in James that they found difficult to characterize politely, a kind of physical carelessness, a lack of investment in the forms of bodily presentation that his position required. James's doublet, the padded jacket that was the primary outer garment of a gentleman in this era, was reportedly not changed or cleaned with the frequency that court protocol expected. His linen, which was the layer of clothing worn directly against the skin, and which was the primary mechanism of personal cleanliness for people who bathed infrequently, was changed, but perhaps not as often as was ideal. He had a tendency to sit in chairs in ways that were considered ungainly for a king sprawling, his legs awkwardly positioned, his body disposed in a way that suggested someone entirely comfortable in the moment regardless of how it appeared to others. He drooled slightly when he drank, which was connected to a tongue that was described by contemporaries as a little too large for his mouth, echoes of Charles II, though in a far milder form. This made drinking in public somewhat awkward and somewhat messy, and it was noticed. He had soft, pale skin that had never seen much sun. James was not a man who cultivated the kind of outdoor vigor that Henry IV of France had, and his complexion reflected the indoor life of a scholar king who had spent his formative years in the often damp and overcast conditions of Scotland. His physique was not impressive. He was described as somewhat soft and somewhat unsteady on his legs, which may have reflected an early encounter with rickets that affected his bone development. And yet he hunted with passionate enthusiasm. This is one of the apparent contradictions of James I, a man who seemed physically unprepossessing and who disliked the sensation of water on his hands, but who spent enormous portions of his time on horseback in all weathers, pursuing deer and other game across the English countryside with the intensity of someone who found in the hunt a physical release that court life did not provide. He would return from these hunts in a state that was, by any measure, quite dirty. Mud, sweat, possibly blood from the kill, the smell of horses and dogs, and the outdoors in whatever state the outdoors was in on that particular day. And then, if the accounts are to be believed, he would not necessarily do very much about this before returning to court. His court at Whitehall had a character that was quite different from the careful, managed grandeur of Elizabeth's court. Elizabeth had been deeply invested in her own public image. She had maintained, right into her old age, the performance of the Virgin Queen, the goddess figure around whom the whole elaborate mythology of her reign revolved. She had understood intuitively and profoundly that the spectacle of monarchy was itself a form of power, and she had managed that spectacle with extraordinary skill. James did not have this skill, or did not choose to exercise it. His court was more informal, more raucous, and more physically disordered than Elizabeth's had been. He liked his favorites, Robert Carr, then George Villiers, later Duke of Buckingham, and promoted them with an enthusiasm that caused significant political controversy, partly because the nature of his attachment to these young men was the subject of contemporary comment and is still the subject of historical debate. He liked theological disputation and could become animated about points of doctrine in ways that his courtiers found difficult to keep up with and occasionally alarming in their intensity. The dogs were there too. James kept hunting dogs with the devotion that we have already seen in Wenceslaus IV, though in a less extreme form. They were in his apartments. They were fed from his table. They contributed, in the way that dogs in indoor spaces inevitably do, to the general olfactory atmosphere. His great intellectual achievement was the Bible. The King James Bible, commissioned in 1604 and completed in 1611, was the product of a collaboration between scholars whose combined learning was extraordinary, organized under the authority and direction of a king who genuinely cared about the outcome. The prose of the King James Bible, its rhythms, its vocabulary, its particular quality of gravitas and intimacy, is one of the supreme achievements of the English language, and it would not exist in the form it has without James's sponsorship and his specific vision of what a Bible in English should be. He also managed the transition from Tudor to Stuart England with more success than his critics give him credit for. The Gunpowder Plot of 1605, the Catholic conspiracy to blow up Parliament that was discovered and prevented, was used by James's government to manage the ongoing tensions of religious politics in ways that were more sophisticated than they sometimes appear. The English colonization of Virginia and other parts of North America began in earnest during his reign. The union of the crowns, the personal union of England and Scotland under one monarch, was established, whatever the complications of actually uniting the two kingdoms in law and governance. He achieved all of this while rubbing his fingers together instead of washing his hands, and while smelling, by multiple accounts, somewhat more pungently than his courtiers would have preferred. James I died in March 1625 at Theobald's house in Hertfordshire of tertian ague, a form of malaria possibly combined with dysentery. He was 58 years old. His death was sudden enough that there was subsequently some suspicion about it, though the historical consensus is that it was simply the disease killing a man whose constitution had been undermined by years of heavy drinking and the various physical compromises of his reign. His son Charles I, who succeeded him, was in almost every physical respect his opposite: elegant, composed, a man who presented himself with the kind of careful dignity that James had never quite managed. Charles I was also beheaded by Parliament in 1649, which suggests that physical dignity alone is not sufficient qualification for successful kingship. but that is another story for another night. Tonight, James rests in Westminster Abbey, in the vault with his Tudor predecessors, the Bible he commissioned still read and loved across the English-speaking world, his hands clean at last by virtue of having ceased to be hands at all. King Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, 1361–1419, the king who would rather have been a huntsman, and as the night deepens, let us travel east again to Bohemia. Bohemia. The name has the sound of romance in it, something of the medieval idea of a place outside the ordinary world, though the Bohemia we are visiting tonight is very much a specific, actual place, the kingdom that occupied approximately the territory of what is now the Czech Republic, a country of forests and silver mines and river valleys, home to one of the oldest universities in Europe, a kingdom with a complex and often turbulent relationship with the Holy Roman Empire that enclosed it. We have already visited the Holy Roman Empire once tonight. We sat with Frederick III and his reluctant amputations, his patient diplomacy, his aching feet. The Bohemian king we are visiting now was Frederick's predecessor as emperor, in a manner of speaking, and his life was in almost every respect more colorful and more catastrophic than Frederick's. Wenceslaus IV became king of Bohemia in 1363, at the age of 2, on the death of his father Charles IV. He became Holy Roman Emperor in 1376 when he was 15. He was then deposed as emperor in 1400, imprisoned by his own nobles at various points, and spent much of his later reign as King of Bohemia in a state of embattled struggle with his own aristocracy, the church, and anyone else who was prepared to challenge his authority. He was not well suited to his positions. This is not to say he was entirely without qualities. He had an interest in art and architecture that left real traces in Prague, whose late Gothic heritage owes something to his patronage. He had moments of political competence. He was not universally terrible, but he was also a man who had a deep, genuine, and apparently unbreakable preference for certain specific activities over the demanding administrative business of governing a kingdom. Those activities were hunting, drinking, and spending time with his dogs. The dogs are where we need to start, because they were central to the domestic reality of Wenceslaus's court in a way that goes beyond the ordinary presence of hunting animals in a medieval household. Wenceslaus kept his dogs in his private apartments. Not in the kennels where hunting dogs were conventionally housed between hunts, but in his own rooms, the rooms where he slept, where he ate, where he conducted whatever business he conducted. These were large hunting dogs, working animals bred and trained for the chase, not small companion animals suited to indoor life. They were with him, apparently, at almost all times. This was remarked upon by contemporaries with varying degrees of bewilderment and disapproval. In the medieval world, the organization of a royal household was understood as a reflection of the king's governing capacity and moral character. A king whose household was orderly, whose chambers were managed with the appropriate dignity, whose domestic arrangements reflected a proper hierarchy of persons and purposes. Such a king was demonstrating, through the management of his private life, that he was fit to manage the public one. A king whose apartments were occupied by hunting dogs that had not been cleaned, that fought and relieved themselves in the royal rooms, that ate from the king's table and slept in the king's bed, was making a rather different statement. The smell of Wenceslaus's chambers must have been notable. The smell of several large, unhousebroken dogs in rooms that were already heated by fires and poorly ventilated. The combination is not subtle. His attendants, who were obliged to be in those rooms as part of their service to the king, managed it as best they could. Fresh rushes more frequently changed, herbs burned or strewn, the strategic deployment of whatever aromatic substances were available. Whether these measures were adequate is not recorded. The general impression from the contemporary sources is that Wenceslaus's apartments had a particular quality that was considered unbecoming of an imperial or royal residence. The drinking contributed. Wenceslaus drank heavily and consistently, beginning, by some accounts, early in the day and maintaining the practice through the afternoon and evening. This was not unusual in principle for a medieval nobleman. The culture of the era supported substantial alcohol consumption at every level of society, and the notion of sobriety as a virtue was not as strongly developed as it would later become. But Wenceslaus's drinking was apparently beyond the social norm even for his time, and its effects were visible in his performance of the duties of office. He was described by contemporaries as being drunk at formal proceedings, at council meetings, at diplomatic occasions, at moments when a king's clear judgment was necessary, and his clouded judgment was instead present. This was not simply embarrassing. It was genuinely damaging to the business of governance, because decisions that needed to be made were being made poorly or not at all, and the people whose livelihoods and safety depended on those decisions were suffering the consequences. His personal cleanliness in this context was another element in a general picture of neglect. He did not bathe with any regularity that the records suggest. He apparently did not change his clothes with the frequency that court expectations required. His hair and beard were described by contemporaries as unkempt in ways that were notable, not the carefully maintained beard of a man who was attending to his appearance, but the beard of a man who had other things on his mind, or no mind for such things at all. There is a famous story about Wenceslaus and a cook. The story appears in several contemporary and near-contemporary sources, with some variation in detail, and its persistence across these sources suggests that it was widely known and widely believed in its own time. According to the story, Wenceslaus ordered one of his cooks to be roasted alive on a spit, the same manner in which the cook himself prepared meat, because the cook had in some way offended or harmed one of the king's favorite dogs. Whether this is literally true is uncertain. The story has the quality of an anecdote that might be exaggerated in the telling, or that might have been invented to make a political point about Wenceslaus's misrule, in the way that unflattering stories were sometimes circulated about unpopular rulers. But what is significant is that it was considered credible. It was told and retold and apparently believed because it was consistent with the general impression that Wenceslaus's priorities were disordered, that he valued his animals more than his human subjects, and that his responses to perceived affronts could be extreme and irrational. Whether or not he roasted a cook, the impression was real. His governance of Bohemia during the period of the Hussite movement, the religious reform movement centered on the teaching of Jan Hus, the Czech theologian who argued for church reform and against clerical corruption, was characteristic. Wenceslaus was neither consistently supportive nor consistently opposed to Hus and his followers. He was inconsistent, which in the context of the religious tensions of early 15th century Bohemia was arguably worse than either position. Hus was eventually handed over to the Council of Constance, an ecumenical council that was supposed to resolve the multiple crises facing the church, and burned at the stake in 1415 in violation of the safe conduct that had been granted for his travel to Constance. The burning of Hus was a catastrophe for Bohemia. It ignited the Hussite Wars, a series of religious and military conflicts that would convulse the kingdom for decades. The Hussites, whose military innovation and religious intensity made them a formidable force, defeated crusade after crusade sent against them, and the wars lasted until the 1430s, well after Wenceslaus's own death. Wenceslaus died in August 1419. The trigger, reportedly, was news of the First Defenestration of Prague, the event in which Hussite militants threw several Catholic councillors from the windows of the Prague town hall, which caused the king such extreme rage or distress that he suffered an apoplectic stroke. He was 57 years old. The grief, if grief it was, of a man who had spent his reign drunk in the company of hunting dogs, and who now found his kingdom erupting into religious violence that his own failures had helped to cause. That grief was real, perhaps. Or perhaps it was simply the body's final protest against years of excess, the accumulated pressure of alcohol and disorder, and the particular stress of being a man who was entirely unsuited to his role but could not leave it. He left behind a Bohemia on the verge of conflagration, a dynasty that would be managed more competently by his successors, and a reputation that has served, in the centuries since, as a useful example of what medieval kingship could look like when the person inside the crown was determined not to meet its requirements. The dogs, presumably, were with him at the end. They were always with him. We are moving toward the final passages of our night's journey now. Two kings remain, and they are two of the most significant figures we have visited. One the epitome of counter-Reformation severity, governing an empire from a bed while his body dissolved. The other the most famous monarch of his age, whose physical transformation from golden youth to immovable old man is one of history's great cautionary tales. Let us take a breath before we enter these last rooms. The fire is very low now. Outside, the night has reached its deepest point, that particular silence that comes after midnight and before the first breath of early morning, when everything is still and the dark is complete, and there is nothing moving in the world except perhaps the slow turn of the stars and the occasional sound of something breathing in the dark. You are still here. You have been here for a long time now, traveling through the centuries, visiting these 9 men and their 9 bodies and their 9 very different versions of the same fundamental story. There is warmth in that, if you will allow it. the warmth of a long journey shared, of the particular companionship that comes from having been given things slowly and without rush, in the way that history gives things when you approach it with patience and without demand. Let us continue. Philip II of Spain, 1527-1598, the most powerful man in the world, and the smell of El Escorial, and as the hour grows late and the fire burns lower, let us return once more to Spain. We have visited Spain twice tonight already, once to see Charles II of Spain, the man who bore in his single body the accumulated genetic consequence of his dynasty's choices, and once, tangentially, through the story of Frederick III, whose Habsburg lineage connected him to the Spanish branch of the family. But the Spain we are visiting now is a different Spain, an earlier, more powerful, more confident Spain, the Spain that was in the process of building the largest empire the world had seen since Rome. And the king we are visiting is the king who sat at the center of all of that power, who directed it and managed it and controlled it, from behind a desk in a palace in the mountains outside Madrid for over 40 years. Philip II of Spain, born in May 1527 in Valladolid. The son of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, the grandson, as we have noted, of Frederick III, whose gangrenous toes we visited a while ago tonight, the father of Philip III, the king who sent the Spanish Armada against England in 1588, the king who presided over the Council of Trent's Counter-Reformation conclusions, the king who governed not only Spain but the Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Sicily, Portugal from 1580, and the expanding territories of Spanish America. The most powerful monarch in the world, by almost any measure available at the time, he was also a man of extraordinary personal discipline. Philip II is not in this story because he was self-indulgent or disordered or careless in the way that some of our other kings were careless. He was, in fact, nearly the opposite of careless. He was meticulous, methodical, deeply serious about his responsibilities, and personally austere in a way that made the contrast with his physical decline all the more poignant. Philip II built El Escorial. This is the first thing you need to know to understand him, because El Escorial is not just a building, it is a statement. It is Philip II's vision of what the center of his world should look like, made permanent in granite and slate, in the mountains north of Madrid at an altitude where the air is cold even in summer. El Escorial is a palace monastery mausoleum complex, all three in one building, the functions integrated in a way that tells you something very specific about how Philip II understood his role. He was king, yes, he was emperor of a vast domain. But he was also, first and foremost in his own understanding of himself, a Catholic monarch, a defender of the faith, a man whose temporal power was in service to a spiritual mission that gave it meaning and purpose. The monastery at the heart of El Escorial was not decorative, it was the point. The monks prayed perpetually for the souls of Philip's dynasty and for the souls of the Spanish dead. The mausoleum was where the dead of the dynasty would rest. The palace was where the living king would work and pray alongside them. The building reflects this. It is enormous but not lavish. Its scale is imperial, but its aesthetic is severe. Stone corridors and stone floors and small windows that admit light carefully rather than abundantly. The rooms are relatively modest by the standards of great European palaces, functional, well-made, serious. There is no hall of mirrors here, no gardens designed to overwhelm the eye with their complexity. El Escorial impresses not through opulence but through gravity. It sits in its mountain landscape and it means it. Philip governed from El Escorial. He governed by paper, a working style that was unusual for monarchs of his era, who typically governed through personal presence and verbal command, in the way that medieval kingship had always worked. Philip instead governed through documents. Petitions, reports, recommendations, decisions, all of it moved through him in written form, and Philip read it all, annotated it all, returned it all with his responses in his own handwriting. This was an enormous amount of work, and Philip did it consistently and thoroughly for decades. The archives of El Escorial contain evidence of this work in staggering quantities, documents bearing Philip's annotations, letters written in his distinctive hand, decisions recorded and returned, the entire administrative machinery of the world's largest empire passing through one man's desk. And as Philip aged, and as the gout that was his Habsburg inheritance took hold of his body, the desk became a bed. Gout, as we have discussed in Frederick II's story, is a disease of diet and genetics. Philip had both the genes and the diet to make it almost inevitable. His disease began in his 40s and progressed steadily through his 50s and into his 60s. It followed the classic pattern: episodic attacks of acute inflammation, periods of relative remission between them, but with each cycle the remissions becoming shorter and the damage accumulating. The joints of his feet, his ankles, his knees, his wrists, his fingers, all were affected. By his 70s, Philip II of Spain could not walk without assistance. Multiple joints were swollen and painful. His hands, which had spent decades annotating documents in the small, precise handwriting that his officials and ambassadors knew so well, were sometimes so afflicted that writing was impossible, and the tophi had developed. Those deposits of uric acid crystals beneath the skin, those accumulations of the disease's long residence in the body, were present around the affected joints and beginning to discharge. Open lesions on the skin around his ankles and knees and fingers. The characteristic chalky white discharge that identifies advanced gout to anyone who has seen it. Philip's attendants managed these lesions with the best knowledge available to them. The wound was cleaned, dressed, covered with whatever preparation the physicians had prescribed, but the preparations of the late 16th century had no antibiotics in them. They could reduce the external contamination, but they could not address the underlying disease, and in the absence of effective treatment, the lesions persisted and occasionally worsened. His apartments at El Escorial, in the final years of his life, had a particular character. Not the magnificent formal scent of incense and ceremony that one might associate with the center of the Counter-Reformation. The smell of gout discharge and the medicaments applied to it is specific and not easily masked, and Philip's rooms had it. His physicians and attendants, who spent their days in close proximity to him, became habituated to it in the way that people become habituated to the persistent smells of the spaces they inhabit. Visitors from outside, arriving in those rooms for an audience with the Spanish king, were encountering it fresh. Philip's governing style adapted to his physical limitations. He had always governed by document. Now he governed entirely by document from his bed. He had a window cut through the wall of his bedroom into the royal chapel so that he could hear mass from his bed without being moved to the chapel. He received visitors in his room. He annotated documents in his bed, propped against pillows, in handwriting that became increasingly difficult as his hands worsened. He sent the Armada from this bed. He received news of the Armada's failure from this bed. He continued to manage from this bed the affairs of an empire that covered a third of the globe. This is one of the more remarkable facts of Philip II's reign, that in the last decade of his life, a man who could not stand unassisted continued to exercise the most extensive sovereign power in the world, entirely by paper, in rooms that smelled of illness, from a bed in a stone palace in a mountain in Spain. The physical endurance required for this, not the heroic, visible endurance of a man on a battlefield, but the quiet, grinding endurance of a man managing extreme pain through the long hours of every day, year after year, without theatrical complaint, is something that deserves acknowledgement even in a story about hygiene. Philip II died in September 1598 at El Escorial. He was 71 years old. His final illness lasted several weeks, and the accounts of those final weeks are not easy to read. The lesions had spread across his body. The smell in his chamber was such that his attendants and the monks who maintained the vigil of prayers around his bed managed it as best they could. He received the last sacraments. He died in the night, with prayers being said around him, in the building he had built as a monument to the faith that had shaped his entire sense of himself and his purpose. The monks continued praying after his death. The building continued to stand. The archives continued to hold his documents, millions of them, the accumulated evidence of a working life of extraordinary discipline and scope. Philip II of Spain was not a perfect king. He made decisions about the Netherlands, about England, about the Inquisition that had terrible consequences and that history has judged harshly. He was inflexible in ways that a more adaptive man might have avoided. He was deeply suspicious and sometimes unjust to the people closest to him, but he was also a man of genuine seriousness and genuine commitment, who worked harder at his job than almost any monarch in European history, and who continued working at it through levels of physical suffering that would have incapacitated most people, right up to the end. The gout could not stop him. Only death could stop him. And when death came, it came for him in the same rooms where he had governed the world, in the smell of his own illness, in the building he had built to house his faith and his family and finally himself. One king remains. The last room is the largest and the most famous, and the one that has been waiting for us all night. Let us go there now, in the final deep hours of this journey, and sit with the story of a man who contains, in some ways, all the others. King Henry VIII of England, 1491–1547, from the most beautiful prince in Europe to a man his own court feared to approach, and so, at last, we arrive at the most famous room in our tour tonight. We have traveled through 9 centuries and visited 8 kings before this one. We have been in France and Russia and Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, and we have come back to England twice. We have visited men of extraordinary variety, the cold paranoia of Ivan, the warm earthiness of Henry IV of France, the impossible grace of Louis XIV, the quiet stubbornness of Frederick, the genetic tragedy of Charles II, the unwashed hands of James I, the canine chaos of Wenceslaus, the bedside empire of Philip II. We have seen bodies that were victims of genetics and bodies that were victims of choices and bodies that were simply carrying the accumulated weight of lives lived at the extreme edge of human power. And now we come to the one who contains, in some ways, all of them. The one who began in magnificence and ended in ruin, who traces in a single life the arc from the most physically impressive prince in Europe to a man who could not stand without assistance, who smelled of illness and whose leg had not properly healed in a decade, who held the power of life and death over everyone around him and could not manage at the end his own body. Henry VIII of England. Let us begin, as I said we would, at the beginning, because the beginning is important. The beginning is not what the portraits show you. The portraits of Henry VIII, and there are many of them, because Henry VIII understood the political importance of images in a way that very few of his contemporaries did. Almost all date from the middle and later portions of his life, when the famous silhouette had already been established. The broad shoulders, the barrel chest, the legs set wide apart, the expression that combines command and challenge in a single look. Hans Holbein the Younger's famous portrait of 1537, the one that has become the template for how we imagine Henry VIII when we imagine him at all, shows a man in his mid-40s at the peak of his outward authority. That man is real. He existed. He was exactly as impressive as he looks, but he was not the first Henry VIII. The first Henry VIII was born in June 1491, the second son of Henry VIII and Elizabeth of York. He had an older brother, Arthur, who was supposed to be the one to carry all this forward. Arthur was the Prince of Wales. Arthur was the heir. Arthur had been married to Catherine of Aragon in the autumn of 1501 in a ceremony of considerable pomp and political significance. Henry was the spare. But Arthur died in April 1502 at Ludlow Castle of what was probably sweating sickness, a viral illness that swept through England in epidemic waves in this era, killing quickly and unpredictably. Arthur was 15 years old, Henry was 10, and everything changed. Henry became the heir to the throne, and he grew. By the time he was crowned King of England in April 1509, at the age of 17, Henry VIII was, and this is not exaggeration or legend, but the consistent testimony of multiple contemporary observers, perhaps the finest-looking royal personage in Europe. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall, which in an era when the average Englishman stood around 5 feet 7 was an almost startling physical presence. He had broad shoulders, a strong chest, well-proportioned limbs. His hair was red gold in the classic Tudor coloring. His complexion was fair and clear. His face was, by multiple accounts, genuinely handsome in the specific way of a young man whose physical gifts have not yet been complicated by experience. The Venetian ambassador, writing in 1515 when Henry was 24, described him as having an extremely fine calf to his leg, his complexion very fair and bright, with auburn hair combed straight and short in the French fashion, and a round face so very beautiful that it would become a pretty woman, his throat being rather long and thick. This is a portrait of a man at the peak of physical beauty, described by someone who had no reason to flatter the King of England beyond the diplomatic minimum. He was also, at this point in his life, genuinely athletic, not the kind of athletic that stands around looking impressive, genuinely, practically, excellently athletic in ways that required sustained effort and skill. He jousted and jousted well. He archered. He wrestled. He played real tennis, a game that requires explosive movement and significant skill, and that was played on a court inside a building, and was nothing like the tennis of your era, being more like squash played with awkward wooden rackets and an inconsistently bouncing ball. He danced. He hunted. He was on horseback for hours at a stretch and showed no sign of finding this difficult. He composed music. Not merely in the sense of having musical ideas that his musicians wrote down for him. He composed, in the technical sense, pieces that survive and that demonstrate genuine musical knowledge and skill. Pastime with Good Company is perhaps the most famous of the pieces attributed to him. He sang. He played several instruments. He was, in the full sense of the word, an accomplished Renaissance prince, the embodiment of the humanist ideal of the complete man. And he kept himself in those early years very well. He was vain about his appearance in the way of someone who has good reason to be vain, and he attended to it accordingly. He changed his shirts frequently. He bathed more often than most men of his era, and certainly more often than the John of England we discussed at the start of our night. His clothes were magnificent. The records of his wardrobe are staggering in their extravagance, and they were maintained with care. He smelled good. He was exactly what a king was supposed to look and feel and smell like. So what happened? The question is important because the answer is not simple. The transformation of Henry VIII from that golden young man to the figure of the later portraits happened over more than 20 years, and it happened through a combination of factors that are both physical and psychological, both the result of specific events and the result of the slow accumulation of a particular life lived in a particular way. The first factor was time, the simple passage of time, doing to Henry's body what time does to all bodies. He was metabolically gifted as a young man. He ate and drank enthusiastically and remained lean because his activity level was high enough to balance the input. But as he aged, and as the physical activity declined, the body that had once processed everything efficiently began to store instead. The second factor was injury. In January 1536, Henry was competing in a tournament, a joust, the sport at which he had excelled for 20 years, and his horse fell. The horse fell on him. Henry was knocked unconscious, and he remained unconscious for 2 hours. This was a serious event by any measure. A 44-year-old man struck by the weight of a horse, lying unconscious for 2 hours. He had also injured his left leg earlier. The records suggest a previous jousting incident had damaged it, and the 1536 fall reactivated or compounded this earlier injury in a way that would not properly heal. Some historians have argued that the head injury sustained in the 1536 fall contributed to personality changes that became apparent in the years following. Increased tyranny, increased emotional volatility, the escalating paranoia of his later years that produced the series of executions that punctuated his reign in its second half. Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, Thomas Cromwell, Catherine Howard, all executed. Some for genuine reasons, some for reasons that seem, from the distance of 5 centuries, to have been generated more by fear and suspicion than by actual evidence of the crimes with which they were charged. This is a medical argument that cannot be definitively proven across the centuries. What is not disputed is that the head injury happened, and that the behavior of Henry VIII changed after 1536 in ways that made him more dangerous to those around him. But the more immediately relevant consequence of the 1536 accident was the leg. The wound to his left leg, reopened and complicated by the fall, would never properly heal. This is one of those medical facts that, once you know it, colors everything else about Henry's later years. For 11 years, from 1536 to his death in 1547, Henry VIII had an ulcer on his left leg that was always present, sometimes better and sometimes worse, requiring constant attention and management, never fully resolved. Without antibiotics, a chronic wound of this kind was almost impossible to clear completely. Infection would establish itself in the wound, be partially controlled by the immune system, and by whatever medical treatments were applied, reduced to a manageable level, and then re-establish when circumstances changed. The wound would weep, it would smell, it would require daily dressing. His physicians tried various remedies. The 16th century had an extensive pharmacopoeia of wound treatments: honey, egg white, various herbal preparations, poultices, a compound involving lead that we now know was toxic but which was believed at the time to have antimicrobial properties. They applied these treatments diligently. They sometimes helped and the wound would improve temporarily, but it never healed. As the years passed and the wound persisted, Henry's activity level declined dramatically. The man who had jousted and hunted and wrestled could no longer joust. His leg made it impossible. Hunting became increasingly difficult and eventually required modifications. Henry is described in his later years being transported around the hunting grounds in a specially constructed carriage, unable to ride for any significant distance. The dancing stopped. The tennis stopped. The physical life that had been the foundation of his earlier identity fell away, piece by piece, as the body that had made it possible refused to cooperate. And without the physical activity that had balanced his diet in his younger years, Henry's weight increased. The trajectory of this increase is documented in his surviving armor, which is one of the most remarkable physical records of any historical figure, a sequence of objects that shows, with the precision of metalwork, the changing dimensions of a human body over time. The Greenwich armor made for the young Henry in the 1510s and 1520s reflects a chest measurement of around 42 inches and a waist of around 32 inches. The armor made for him in the 1540s reflects a waist of approximately 54 inches and a chest to match. These are not rough estimates, they are the precise measurements of metal formed around a body. By the end of his life, Henry VIII weighed, by the estimates of various historians and medical analysts working from the physical evidence, somewhere between 300 and 320 pounds, possibly more. He needed a mechanical device called a hoist to be lifted up and down staircases, because he could no longer manage stairs under his own power. He was carried between rooms on a specially constructed chair. The hygiene implications of this were significant. Bathing a man of Henry's size and physical limitations in the 16th century was a logistical challenge. He could not easily get in and out of a bathing vessel. The attendants, the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, whose role included the intimate physical care of the king's body, managed this as best they could, but the frequency and thoroughness of bathing that would have been possible for a physically able and mobile man was simply not achievable in Henry's circumstances. He was bathed, but infrequently, and the completeness of the bathing that was possible was limited. His shirt changes, the primary mechanism of personal cleanliness, as we have discussed, continued. He changed his shirts, he had his hair cut and his beard trimmed. The physical maintenance of his appearance continued, managed by others since he could not always do it himself. But a very large body, with a chronic infected wound on one leg, in an era without antibiotics or effective wound management, being bathed infrequently, and otherwise maintained by servants in a court that moved and ate and drank, and kept dogs and burned coal and candles, and lived in the specific material reality of mid-16th century England. That body had a presence that the careful management of his shirts and his hair could not fully contain. The smell of Henry VII's apartments in his last years was described by various contemporaries and later historians. The wound discharged. The medicaments applied to the wound had their own smell. The sweat of a large body in a heated room, inadequately bathed, accumulated over days. The specific quality of chronic illness, that slightly sweet, slightly sharp smell that people who work with the chronically ill recognize, was part of it. His court managed this. The gentlemen of the Privy Chamber were trained in the physical reality of the royal body in all its dimensions, and they performed their duties with the professionalism that their positions required. Herbs were burned, scented rushes were laid, pomanders, small perforated containers of aromatic spices, were carried and hung in rooms. All of these were the standard tools of the era for managing ambient smell, and they were deployed. His temper in this period was extraordinary. Not new, Henry had always had a volatile temper, but the combination of chronic pain, limited mobility, the frustration of a man whose physical identity had been so central to his sense of himself, now largely denied to him, and possibly the continuing effects of whatever head injury the 1536 fall had produced. All of this made the Henry of the 1540s genuinely dangerous in a way that created a pervasive anxiety throughout his court. People were afraid of him. Not the generalized, theoretically appropriate fear that subjects were supposed to feel before a monarch, a specific, practical, well-founded fear of a man who had executed his ministers, his wives, his friends, and who showed no particular sign of having finished. To be close to Henry VIII in his last years was to be close to a source of enormous, unpredictable, potentially lethal power, and the people who were close to him, who dressed him and carried him and tended his wound and managed his smell, did so with a watchfulness that never quite relaxed. Henry VIII died in January 1547 at the Palace of Whitehall in London. He was 55 years old. His body was placed in a lead-lined coffin and transported to Windsor for burial in St. George's Chapel, alongside his third wife Jane Seymour, the only wife who had given him a legitimate male heir and who had died in childbed doing so. On the journey to Windsor, there was an overnight stop at Sion Abbey. And there is a story which has been told since the 16th century, which appears in sources of varying reliability, which is possibly true and possibly embellished and possibly invented, about what happened at Sion. According to this story, the coffin leaked overnight. Fluid from the decomposing body, this was January, and the body had been several days in transit already, seeped from the lead lining, or from a joint in the lead lining, onto the floor of the chapel where the coffin rested. And a dog, drawn by the smell, was found in the morning licking at the fluid. Whether or not this literally happened, the story found a ready audience because it connected to something that was known, that a friar had supposedly told Henry, years before his death, that dogs would lick his blood, just as they had licked the blood of the wicked King Ahab in the Book of Kings. The prophecy, if it was made, fulfilled itself in this story, and the story was told and retold as a kind of divine commentary on the life of a man who had been, by any accounting, remarkable in both his gifts and his cruelties. He was buried at Windsor. He is still there. His effigy in the memorial that was eventually placed there shows him as he appeared in the Holbein portraits, broad, commanding, arms out, the posture of absolute authority. The stone face gives nothing away. It offers no confession of the leg, no acknowledgement of the smell, no indication of the distance between the image it presents and the physical reality it represents. Holbein's portraits do not smell. Stone effigies do not either, but the records do. The inventory of the medical treatments applied to the leg, the architectural evidence of the mechanical lifts installed to move the king between floors, the accounts of his increasing immobility. The testimony of the people who served him in his final years, which comes through in the gaps and in the euphemisms, and in the careful language of people who knew things that were not entirely safe to say clearly. The Golden Prince of 1509 and the immovable King of 1546 are the same person. There is no other Henry. There was never a break in the line, never a moment when a different person stepped into the role. There was just one man, aging and injured and in pain, carrying within himself both the memory of what he had been and the reality of what he had become, surrounded by people who feared him and served him and managed the daily reality of his body with whatever the 16th century had to offer. That man was very human. He was completely, unreservedly, inescapably human. And that, in the end, is the most remarkable thing about him. The long sleep of history, the night is very deep now. Outside, whatever surrounds the space where you are lying or sitting or gently drifting, whatever the world looks like beyond these walls in this hour, is still. The deepest stillness of the deepest hour, when everything unnecessary has let itself fall away and only the essential remains, your breathing and the dark and the slow, soft turning of the world beneath you. We have been traveling for a long time. 9 kings, 9 bodies. 9 centuries of private reality lying beneath the public record, waiting to be found by whoever was patient enough to look. We have found some of it tonight, in the slow and careful way that this kind of history rewards. Not the dramatic history, not the battles and the treaties and the dates that appear in textbooks. The intimate history, the history of skin and breath and the smell of a room and the weight of a body that has been alive for 50 years and carries all of that living with it. Let us sit here for a moment in the quiet that follows a long journey. There is something worth naming before the night fully closes, something that has been threading through all 10 of these chapters like a single color running through very different fabrics. It is not a conclusion exactly, and it is not a moral, because history rarely offers clean conclusions or clean morals, and the ones it does offer are usually less interesting than the questions it opens. It is more like a texture, a feeling that accumulates from the long evenings listening. These men were all simultaneously larger than life and entirely human. Larger than life in the way that genuine historical significance makes you larger than life. They changed things. Their decisions about wars, about religion, about law, about the structure of power had consequences that are still visible in the world you live in. The Magna Carta that John was forced to sign is an ancestor of your legal rights. The Edict of Nantes that Henry IV of France issued is an ancestor of the religious tolerance that modern liberal democracies embody. The King James Bible that James I commissioned shaped the English language in ways that reach into every English sentence ever written since. The Habsburg dynasty that Frederick III tended so carefully and patiently gave Europe a form of continental stability that shaped international relations for centuries. These were real effects produced by real people, and they met. And entirely human in the way that anyone who has ever lived in a body is human. They were hungry and they ate. They were tired and they slept. They were cold and they looked for warmth. They were in pain and the pain was real. They smelled because all bodies smell, and in their world the tools for managing that were less effective than in yours. They aged, they declined. They died, every one of them, in ways that stripped away the ceremony and the symbol and left what had always been there underneath, a person in a bed at the end of a life. John died of dysentery in Newark Castle, 49 years old and somewhat disheveled. Henry IV died of a knife in the Rue de la Ferronnerie, 56 years old and probably smelling of garlic right up to the end. Louis XIV died of gangrene in his golden bed at Versailles, 76 years old and enormously celebrated. Ivan died over a chess game in Moscow, 53 years old and probably still in the grip of whatever darkness had animated him. Frederick died in Linz without several of his toes, 77 years old and patient to the last. Charles II died in Madrid, 38 years old and probably grateful, on whatever level consciousness allows, for the end of a very difficult life. James died of ague in Hertfordshire, 58 years old, the Bible he commissioned already 3 decades old and already changing the world. Wenceslaus died of rage in Prague, 57 years old, his dogs probably still in the room. Philip died at El Escorial, 71 years old, with monks praying around his bed and documents probably still waiting on his desk. Henry died at Whitehall, 55 years old, his leg finally at rest. 10 deaths, all of them ordinary in the fundamental sense. All of them simply what happens when a person stops living. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows a long list of deaths, even deaths centuries old, even deaths of people you never knew. There is weight in it. Not grief exactly. You did not know these men, and they were complicated people in complicated circumstances. And grief is too simple a word for the feeling this kind of history produces. Something more like recognition. Recognition of the shared condition, the common ground of having been alive and eventually not alive, of having inhabited a body in a world that placed enormous demands on it. You are in a body right now. It is breathing. It is keeping you warm. It is doing in the background the thousand small things that bodies do without announcing themselves, digesting, circulating, repairing, maintaining the conditions for consciousness. It will require sleep. It will require food tomorrow morning. It will have days when it hurts and days when it feels effortlessly comfortable and days when it is simply there, neither particularly good nor particularly bad, just carrying you through the ordinary hours. All of these men had that. Under the crowns and the armor and the ermine and the ceremony, they had that. The specific weight of their own body and the specific requirements of being inside it, which no amount of power could entirely override. This is the most human thing about them. It is also the most human thing about you. The fire, wherever it is in the imagined room of this late hour, has burned down to coals. Not out, there is still warmth in it, still a faint orange glow in the center of the darkness, the kind of fire that requires nothing from you, that simply continues its slow work of giving heat. You could sleep by this fire. You could be very comfortable by this fire, in the particular comfort of a body that has been still for a long time and is ready for the longer stillness of sleep. Outside, nothing is happening. The world has given you a quiet night, and you have used it well, and the night is ending now in the way that good nights end. Not with a bang, not with a conclusion, but with a long, slow fading, like music that diminishes rather than stops, like light that softens rather than goes out. The 9 kings are asleep. John in Worcester Cathedral, under his elegant stone face with the crown on it. Henry IV in the Basilique Saint-Denis, where the kings of France were buried for 1,000 years. Louis XIV in the same basilica, in a coffin that cannot quite contain the magnificence of the life it holds. Ivan in the Cathedral of the Archangel in Moscow, in the Orthodox tradition of his faith. Frederick in the Stephansdom in Vienna, in the tomb he designed so carefully for so long. Charles II in El Escorial, yes, in the same place we left Philip II, because the Spanish kings buried their own in the royal mausoleum that Philip had built. James in Westminster Abbey, with the Tudors around him. Wenceslaus in St. Vitus Cathedral in Prague, in the heart of the city that outlasted his misrule. Philip in El Escorial, the building he built, the building that was designed to be his tomb as much as his palace. Henry in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, beside Jane Seymour, as he had asked. All of them sleeping the long sleep. All of them finally clean, in whatever sense the long dead are clean, free of the demands of the body, free of the accumulated urgency of living, free of the smell and the pain and the labor and the politics and the fear and the love and the hunger and the cold, free of all of it, resting. You can rest now too. There is nothing more required of you tonight. The journey has been long and the stories have been many, and the night has done its work around you, turning the world slowly toward the morning that is coming in a few hours, bringing with it whatever the day holds. You do not need to remember everything. You do not need to carry every detail of every chapter into tomorrow. What stays will stay, some image, some phrase, some moment in the telling that landed somewhere particular and decided to remain. Frederick waiting too long. Henry smelling of garlic and not caring, the hall of mirrors and what was underneath it. Ivan in the banya with the steam rising, the dogs with Wenceslaus, Philip annotating in bed, John rising late, Charles whose body was the end of a dynasty, Henry, that golden prince in the photograph that history took of him at 17 and that nobody in his world knew would be the last one that showed him that way. These things will stay or they will not, and either way is fine. The past is patient. It will be there when you come back to it. For now, let the stories settle. Let them find whatever place they're going to find in the long, quiet architecture of everything you know. Let the night do what it does. The coals have gone a little lower. The room, this imagined room, this soft and firelit space that we have been sharing all evening, is very warm and very still. The darkness outside the windows, if there are windows, is the particular darkness of the last hour before the world begins again. Not quite black anymore. Not light, not yet. something in between, something that belongs entirely to this hour and will not persist into the morning. You are here. You have been here for a long time, traveling and listening and sitting with the strangeness and the ordinariness of lives very different from yours, and you have been generous with your time and your attention, and the past is grateful, in whatever way the past can be grateful, which may be only the gratitude of being witnessed. Every life that is truly witnessed, truly attended to, truly held in the imagination of someone living and curious and present, is a life that continues in some small way, not in the mystical sense, but in the simple sense. John of England is, in some small way, more present in the world tonight than he was this morning. Frederick's feet are known to someone tonight who did not know about them before. Henry IV's garlic is alive in a story being told to someone resting in the dark. This is what history is at its most fundamental, the act of paying attention to the past, the act of saying, this happened, these people were here, their lives mattered, not in the grand sense of changing everything, but in the simple sense of having been lived. You have done that tonight, you have paid attention. You have been present for 9 kings and their 9 bodies and their 9 very human lives. And tomorrow or next week or in some quiet moment months from now, some small fragment of what we have built here tonight will surface unexpectedly, the way certain memories do, a smell, a word, the image of a medieval court in candlelight, and the specific, fascinating, endlessly human reality of the people who lived there. Sleep well. The kings are sleeping. The fire is breathing. The night is perfect. And tomorrow, whenever it comes, will be better for this long, slow, candlelit visit to the people who lived before us, in all their magnificent and disheveled and utterly recognizable humanity. Good night.